few chapters. But that's one of the things that's controlled there in the medulla. There's a bunch of there's five cranial nerves that come out of the medulla. Number 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. That's easy to remember. It's the last five. And since the medulla is the lowest part of the brain, that makes sense. One last word about the cranial nerves, because you've probably never even heard about them before. We have 31 pairs of peripheral nerves, spinal nerves, that come off the spinal cord. C1, C2, C3, we have really creative names for them, depending on where they come out between the vertebrae. But we also have 12 cranial nerves, and 12 cranial nerves come directly out of the brain. And that's why they're called cranial nerves. That's why they're handled a little bit differently, because they're quite different from each other. As an example, cranial nerve 1 carries your sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2 carries your vision. We'll come back to those. But the 12 cranial nerves are just basically nerves that come straight out of the brain. Going on upstream, the next level is the pons. The pons is that thing that links the brain with the cerebellum. And then on upstream, the pons is really obvious on your brains, and you see that it contains the sensory and motor nuclei of the next 4 nerves up the stream, number 8, number 7, number 6, and number 5. Everybody know their Roman numerals? Kind of need to know that to do this. That's why we require algebra. I'm just kidding. So the pons is very important in our breathing. It keeps us breathing regularly. It's the thing that when we start to breathe in, it tells us when to quit. It tells us don't pop your lungs. Don't keep breathing in and in and in and in until you pop your lungs. So it controls those sort of things. And mostly it controls this information going to the cerebellum. That's what I was trying to illustrate yesterday when I was standing on one leg up there at the front of the room, because all of that information from those muscles, nerves, proprioceptive fibers, and so forth down in my body go back up to the cerebellum, which then processes that and keeps me somewhat coordinated. Here's the medulla. Here are a number of the different nuclei. Please, you do not need to memorize these. These two here you probably ought to know. They're called the olives, the olivary nuclei. And if you look right here on the brain, they're really obvious. In fact, it's one of the things that really allows you to know where you're at. The olives, just on the outside here, and then the pyramids in the middle. These contain lots of fibers that are going to your muscles down in your legs and arms and so forth. But please don't feel like you need to memorize all of this. Here's the pons right here. This is the medulla down here. What does the cerebellum do? Basically, it adjusts your postural muscles. It's what keeps me standing on that one leg. It also fine-tunes a lot of your conscious and subconscious movements. For example, when you walk. When we walk, we don't actually have to think as we put our one foot in front of the other. We don't have to think, okay, pick up your back foot. Okay, flex your ankle a little bit. Now swing it through. Now point your toe a little bit and land on your toe. And kind of keep swinging your weight. Those become very automatic movements that are controlled by your subconscious and allow you to do a lot of things like that without thinking every little bit of it. In the cerebellum, you need to look for the Purkinje cells. You'll see these under the microscope. Just as an example of how complex things are up here, these Purkinje cells are found in the cerebellar cortex, in other words, in the surface of the cerebellum. And each one of these cells may be receiving input from 200,000 other nerve cells that are sending information to it, so that it in turn can then send it on to a motor thing and send the message back to the motor nerves to keep everything coordinated. So the cerebellum is extremely complex, and that's how we become coordinated. The arbor vitae, what does that mean? Tree of life, that's right, arbor vitae. Basically, it's nothing more than a pattern that you see when you cut the cerebellum down the middle. I'll show it to you in just a second. But it's just a pattern that looks like a leaf to me, and it has all these nuclei running through it that help with this coordination thing. Several other parts of the cerebellum illustrated here, the superior, middle, and inferior parts of the cerebellum. Please, I don't think that's very key. Just know what the cerebellum does. You've seen people that have ataxia. Ataxia is a very damaging disorder where you really just can't control your muscles and nerves. And you've seen Donald Trump imitate a guy who has ataxia that had a paralyzed arm, and you've also seen people that walk kind of funny like that. That's because their cerebellums aren't working right, and that can be obviously a really tough problem for them. The thing that's important to know is that they're perfectly conscious. They know everything. They're as smart as you and me. They just can't control their muscles. They can't control their body that well. Same thing goes for kids with cerebral palsy. Some of them have terrible muscular and movement disorders, but yet they're brilliant inside. It's just hard to get it out of them because they have a hard time talking, moving their muscles in order to make language. Now, we've all been a little bit ataxic before, if we've ever been intoxicated. And if you watch, if you've ever been stopped by a policeman, and he will say things to you like, okay, take your fingers, close your eyes, now touch your nose. And by God, you just hope you touch your nose just right. You know, I always dream of doing that sort of thing, and the cops, they kind of know what to do with that. The other thing that the cops will do is look at your eye movements. Once again, testing your cerebellum. And they'll say, watch my finger, watch it over there, and people's eyes start to waver. They kind of shake. It's called nystagmus. We'll talk about that later too. So ataxia is a disturbance of muscle coordination. I think I have some patient videos to show you that real quick. But your cerebellum is so important to you. You just thank your cerebellum every day that you can get up and walk. This is what the cerebellum looks like from the outside. One lobe, or one hemisphere. Basically, there's a little strip down the middle here that's called the vermis. Vermis means worm. Does it look like a worm? I don't know. This little part right there. Anyway, those are the parts of the cerebellum. Now, if you cut the cerebellum open, it looks like this right here. If you cut it open in the middle, this is the thing called the arbor vitae, okay? The tree of life, the leaf pattern. Notice that the cerebellum sits on top of the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle of the ventricular system, and notice that on the floor of the fourth ventricle, just like on the floor of the other ventricles, there is a choroid plexus. What's made in the choroid plexus? CSF, correct. Going on upstream, the thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland. I think the only thing you need to know about the pineal gland is that it makes melatonin. You need to know where it is too, and you'll see that on your models and on the sheep brains that we're going to do. Pineal gland, the main thing to know is it makes melatonin. What's melatonin?
What makes you sleepy?
What makes you sleepy, that's right. And so melatonin, in fact, I've got a big bottle of it sitting beside my bed. I used to think it helped me sleep. Now I'm not sure it even does. I think I'll just throw it away. But it's a natural a drug that's supposed to help you get off to sleep. it's also part of the old circadian rhythm thing that makes you get sleepy in the evenings and wake up in the morning and pretty much stay awake during the day. Those are important things. The thalamus lives up on top. It's just above the medulla. It lives on top of the third ventricle. It has a right and left thalamus, whatever that means. I mean, doesn't everything have a right and left? But the thalamus is a relay station. So if you want to learn one fact that is most important about the thalamus, know that the thalamus is a relay station. It sort of decides what goes to your brain, to your conscious level, and what doesn't. Now here's an example of how the thalamus works. How many of y'all have heard the projector fan during this lecture? Anybody heard it? You can hear it, can't you? Because I mentioned it. Well, your thalamus is getting input like that from everywhere all the time. It's getting visual information. You know, a lot of things don't come to your conscious level, but you're getting input because our ears are working all the time and we're hearing things like that. So those signals are coming into our ear, and from our ear they go to our thalamus, and our thalamus kind of weeds a lot of them out. It says, you know what? Yeah, I can hear that motor. It's back there, but I'm not going to think about it. So it doesn't send those messages on up to your conscious level. Now, I've asked that question in classrooms before. Maybe we just have a really nice, quiet fan. And I've had like every single kid puts their hand, oh yeah, I've heard that fan. And so then I ask another question. How many of you, while you've been sitting here, have felt your shirt touching your right shoulder, your left shoulder? Have you felt that? No, but you could, couldn't you? I mean, you know there's a shirt and it's touching your skin right there, right? But that information is so boring or so unimportant to your life or so important to your brain that it just doesn't get through. Now, if you think about it, if you touch your arm, yeah, you will feel your shirt. But the point is, there's a whole lot of input that comes into our bodies every second of every day that doesn't make it all the way up to our conscious level. And that's one of the major things that the thalamus does. Okay, so the thalamus is a relay station, and you'll see that on a test or two. Yeah?
So is the thalamus part of the diencephalon?
Yes. There's where it is. It's kind of right there in the middle. This is this is buried under the parts of the cerebrum, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we will in a minute. So here's the thalamus. All these different parts of the thalamus. Once again, I do not want you to learn these. I don't think you need to know that there's an anterior group and a medial group and sensory input and visual input. Just know that the thalamus is this major relay system, and it's a relay stop, and it decides what goes on up above. All the stuff is coming in, you see, from the bottom, and some of it's going out, but not that much necessarily. Mammillary bodies are another thing you ought to be able to see on your models and identify. It controls the eating movements. The infundibulum is this little tag that hangs down, and the pituitary gland hangs off the bottom of it. We will go in and talk about the pituitary in great detail here in a couple chapters when we get to the endocrine system. We'll kind of skip over it right now. The tuberal area is just kind of an in-between area again. Here's another close-up of this thing. Here's the thalamus up in this area. These are all different centers in the thalamus that I think, once again, you don't need to know. You just need to know that the thalamus is a relay area for lots of different things, such as autonomic centers, vision, so forth. Here's what it looks like on a midline cut through the brain, and you should be able to identify all of these different things on your brain. We have nice models, half-head models, half-brain models we call them over there. Here's the pons down here, here's the cerebellum down here. This is the midbrain in through here. Here's the optic nerve. Here is where the infundibulum is, and the pituitary gland would normally hang right here off of the infundibulum. Please know that I've never seen a pituitary gland in lab. The reason is these brains, they're basically harvested at the stockyards where they're harvesting them out of sheep that are being used for their meat, I guess. And they don't go to great pains to dissect this out really carefully. And as a result, when they just kind of pull it out of the bottom of the skull, they pull the pituitary gland off. So you probably won't see that. But you will on our models. Our models, they got it on there really nice. Just a couple of mentions up higher here. Here's this is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a huge number of brain fibers that are carrying messages from one side of your brain to the other side. It's really important that the right side of your brain knows what the left side of your brain is seeing and talking and doing and moving and so forth. And a lot of that back and forth from side to side is carried through the corpus callosum. Now you remember there was these areas in the spinal cord, when you studied the spinal cord, remember that carried messages back and forth from side to side? What were those areas called? Huh? The commissures. Remember the anterior and posterior commissures, which carried information from one side of the spinal cord to the other. Well, that's kind of what the corpus callosum is here. Might want to check that out. 8 functions of the hypothalamus. This is a list you ought to think about, but I'm not going to ask you to reproduce it for me. You know, as you can tell, the hypothalamus is just below the thalamus, and it participates in lots of things that your body does, like the control of your skeletal muscles, control of the autonomic functions, the automatic functions that we've talked about, coordinates the activities of the nervous system and the endocrine system. One thing I want you to learn from this course is that the nervous system is the system we use to make very rapid changes. You know, if we step on a pin, we pull our foot off the pin, and that happens in a 1/10 of a second. And that's a quick adaptation to prevent us being injured. So the nervous system controls everything right here in the here and now, but the endocrine system is just as important, and it controls things in the longer term. The endocrine system controls things like how tall you're going to be, controls things about how strong you're going to be. It controls things like at what age are you going to undergo puberty? At what age are you going to start having menstrual cycles if you're a female? At what stage or at what time of your life are you going to get hair on your chest, for example? All of those things are controlled by the endocrine system, and they're just as important as the sudden instant things that we do with our nervous system. So really we have these 2 control systems of our body, and the place that they interact with each other is here in the hypothalamus. And just below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which is then going to reach out and send little hormones, releasing hormones and so forth, to all the other endocrine glands in your body. Your ovaries, your testicles, your thyroid gland, your adrenal glands, so forth. The hypothalamus makes 2 hormones. We'll come back to these, but you ought to know at least the names of them right now. One of them is called ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. What do you think that means? What does anti-diuretic mean? What's a diuretic?
Makes you have to go to the bathroom.
Makes you pee, makes you make urine, yes. So the best diuretic in the world is water. If you drink water, you will make pee, right? If you take Lasix or hydrochlorothiazide or a lot of the drugs that we give patients, you'll make more urine. We do that, we kind of force urine out of them so they don't have so much fluid in them if they have high blood pressure, for example. So ADH is really important, and it helps us control the amount of fluid we have in our body all the time. And it's from the hypothalamus. And the other one is oxytocin. What's oxytocin? Anybody ever heard that word before? Come on, ladies.
Isn't it a cuddle hormone kind of?
A cuddle hormone. Very good. Yes, very good. The fact of the matter is, it's what puts you into labor, and also has a great impact on ladies who have a baby and causes their milk to drop, sort of their milk to begin to be produced. So, yes. Good answer though, cuddle hormone. I've heard it called that before. What did I do? Go through a bunch of slides like a dummy? Yeah, here we are. There we are, oxytocin. And then here we go. Emotional things are controlled in the hypothalamus. Thirst and hunger, those are pretty important. You know, if your blood sugar is dropping and you're getting hungry, this is your hypothalamus is what reads that and says, hey, we need to eat. Or if you're getting really dry, hey, we need to drink. Controls a number of these voluntary and autonomic functions that we just mentioned. Helps regulate your body temperature. Do you remember on the first day of A&P when they were talking about negative feedback? And they were talking about, maybe your teacher didn't, but I always do, talk about the thermostat on the wall of the room, and when the temperature goes down, the thermostat interprets that and sends the message up to the air conditioning unit up on top to turn the air conditioning on. Air conditioner comes on, it lowers the temperature. The box reads it, turns the air conditioner off, and it cycles on and off as the temperature goes up and down through a little narrow region. Well, the hypothalamus is the thermostat. That's where our body is reading your temperature. So if you wanted to fake the body out that it was really hot, all you have to do is heat up the hypothalamus, and your body will do everything it can to cool down. That's only done in an experimental sort of fashion. Okay, and the circadian rhythm thing, which we'll just mention. The limbic system is a bunch of things that parts of the brain. They're not. It's a functional group. This is important that you know. It's a functional group. In other words, you can't say look at the cut brain and say that's the limbic system. It's not like that. It's a bunch of other areas of the brain that kind of work together, but they're a functional group, not an anatomic group. And they control things like your emotional states, and it helps you become more alert, helps you memorize better, retrieve better, and establish your emotional states. It's very important for people studying A&P. Be sure their limbic system is awake all the time. The last part of the brain is the most important, the cerebrum. It controls everything that we think about, everything that we memorize, everything we learn. It controls it controls everything about our body that's under our control. When I want to move my arm up, it's my cerebrum that says, hey, bend your elbow, and I do it. Okay? When I lay in bed at night and have a dream, that's from my cerebrum and so forth. The cerebrum is just opposite of the spinal cord. Remember that spinal cord, how the white matter was on the outside and the gray matter was in the middle? That's because, why is it gray? Why is gray matter gray? because all the nuclei, the cell bodies are in the gray matter. Well, it's just the opposite in the cerebrum, and that is that the white matter is deep and the gray matter is on the outside. Okay, so all those cells that do our thinking are right there on the surface. Probably one of the reasons that the concussions are so disturbing to our intellectual function is because the first thing that gets hit is the gray matter on the outside of your brain. We also have some areas of gray matter deep down in the brain, and just so you know, we call those the basal nuclei. And we'll talk about a few of them, but we're not going to be neuroanatomists when we come out of here. Okay, here's the parts of the brain that you need to know. You need to know that the front part is called the frontal lobe. And guess what bone it's under? The frontal bone, right? This middle area here is called this part in here is called the parietal lobe. Parietal bone, get it? Occipital lobe, occipital bone. Temporal lobe, temporal bone. You see, you only have to learn this stuff once, and then it kind of ties over, right? So these are the regions. Then there's these are all these little loops and things are called gyri and sulci. Right? Sulcuses are the little grooves down in the valleys, and the gyri are the things on top. And we have two of them that are important that you recognize. One is called the lateral sulcus that runs right across through here, and one is called the central sulcus, which comes right up through here. Now, you know, if you said, well, Dr. Sessions, I think this is the central sulcus right here, I would probably say, yeah, you're probably right. I mean, it's kind of nebulous. But just know that there's a central sulcus up and through here, and then the lateral sulcus here. Now, let's talk about the different regions just a little bit. How many of you have seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Great movie, huh? I saw it at Portland Center Stage a year or two ago. Really great production. Well, there was this guy who was in this nut house who probably got himself committed in order to keep from going to jail, right? Played by Jack Nicholson in the movie version of it. And towards the end of the movie, Nurse Ratched decided he was just a crazy nut and he needed to have this operation. And you remember what that operation was? Well, he had that first, but then he had surgery. He had a frontal lobotomy. Okay, a frontal lobotomy. Well, guess what? That's what used to be done, was they would just, for crazy folks, for psychiatric cases a lot of times, they would take out the frontal lobe thinking, oh, that's the source of all these ill thoughts and so forth. One of the Kennedy children, I believe, had that done. She just sort of kind of became a veg the rest of her life. One of Jack Kennedy's sisters, I believe, Bobby Kennedy's sister. I may be one generation off there. Anyway, well, it didn't work, so they quit doing it. We don't do that anymore. But yeah, there you go. There's the tie-in with One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest. We'll go over the different functions of the different regions shortly. Here's another point that I would make. One thing you need to know, and I'm going to tell you how to remember this. The frontal lobe is up here in front. Like I said, it has kind of nebulous purposes. But the precentral gyrus, which is this big gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, okay, we call this the precentral gyrus. And the one right behind it we call the postcentral gyrus. Now those are really important. And the reason they're really important is because the precentral gyrus is what controls all of your muscles. Okay? And the postcentral gyrus is what controls all of your sensation. Your touch, feel, temperature, and all that stuff.
How do you remember that? Well, here's a clue that I've told to lots of classes, and everybody remembers this 5 years later. This is the front of the brain, right? So this is the precentral gyrus. And I always remember from my high school days, when you were in the front seat of the car, you had to do the muscle things. You had to steer, you had to put the brakes on, you had to turn your neck. You did all the muscular activities in the front. Now, later that night, when you drove to the drive-in movie theater, which y'all don't get to experience anymore hardly. I guess there's one left in Oregon. Two? Well, you get to use your post-central gyrus back there because you get to feel stuff and things get felt. And it's a very sensational, sensing moment. So front is motor, back is sensory. Okay? Hope that helps you remember it. We'll talk about other different regions here in the next few minutes. There's one other big important gyrus that's inside that you don't see from the outside of the brain on that other picture, and it's called the cingulate gyrus, and it runs right around here just above the corpus callosum, that side-to-side set of fibers that's going back and forth. So you've got your frontal lobe up in front, parietal, occipital, and the cingulate is inside. Three functional principles of the cerebrum. You know, you've heard the term right brain or left brain. I would just say that those are very vague differentiations. It's not like one side of your brain controls music and one side of your brain controls mechanical things. They basically know that each side of the brain receives information from and sends motor commands to the opposite side of the body. So in order to move this hand here, it's this side of my brain that's controlling that. When I feel something or burn my hand on this side, it's going to this side of my brain, okay? The sensory region of this side of my brain, post-central sulcus, right? Just post-central gyrus, I guess. Both hemispheres do all of that for the other side of the body. The correspondence between a specific function and a specific region is not very precise. So even though we're going to tell you that there's areas of the brain that control your vision, and there's areas that control your hearing, and there's areas that control your orientation, it's not all that exact, okay? And it'd be nice if we could just put a needle and touch different parts of people's brains and they could tell us exactly what they're feeling or what's happening, you know, whether their one finger is jerking or something.